In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where red rock canyons carve ancient secrets into the earth and endless skies stretch beyond comprehension, a young man vanished without a trace in 1934. His name was Everett Roos, and his disappearance has haunted explorers, artists, and mystery seekers for nearly a century. This is not just another missing person case. This is the story of a passionate soul who chose the wilderness over civilization, who sought beauty in the most remote corners of Utah's unforgiving desert, and who left behind only poetry, paintings, and an enduring mystery that continues to baffle investigators to this day. 20-year-old Everett Roos was not your typical young man of the 1930s. While his peers were settling into conventional lives in cities, seeking steady employment during the Great Depression, Everett was drawn to something far more profound and dangerous. He was an artist, a poet, a wanderer who believed that life's greatest treasures could only be found in the wild places where few dared to venture. His writings reveal a soul that burned with an intensity rarely seen, someone who understood that true living meant embracing risk, solitude, and the raw beauty of untamed landscapes. Born in Los Angeles on March 28, 1914, Everett showed an early fascination with the natural world that would define his brief but remarkable life. His parents, Christopher and Stella Ruiz, were educated, progressive individuals who encouraged their son's artistic pursuits and unconventional path. Unlike many families of the era, they supported Everett's dream to explore the American West, even financing his expeditions when his art sales fell short. This support would make his eventual disappearance all the more heartbreaking, as they had willingly let their beloved son venture into some of the most dangerous wilderness areas in the country. By the time he was 16, Everett had already begun his solo journeys into the wilderness. These weren't casual camping trips or guided tours. He was venturing alone into territories that challenged even experienced outdoorsmen, carrying only basic supplies, his art materials, and an unshakable belief that the wilderness held answers that civilization could never provide. He traveled with burros and horses, creating temporary camps in remote canyons, spending weeks or even months completely cut off from the outside world. His artistic talent was undeniable. Everett created woodblock prints, watercolors, and detailed sketches that captured not just the visual beauty of the landscapes he encountered, but something deeper, more spiritual. His work showed an understanding of light and shadow, of the way morning sun transforms red rock into living fire, of how desert storms can turn peaceful canyons into torrents of destruction. He sold his artwork whenever possible, often trading pieces for supplies or money to fund his next expedition. But it was his writing that truly revealed the depth of his character. Everett's letters and journal entries read like the work of someone far older and more experienced than his actual years. He wrote with a poetic sensibility that captured both the physical beauty of the places he visited and the profound emotional impact they had on his soul. In one letter to his brother, he wrote words that would prove eerily prophetic. "I have always been unsatisfied with life as most people live it." Between 1931 and 1934, Everett completed 4 major solo expeditions that took him through some of the most challenging terrain in the American West. He explored the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, the high deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, the canyon country of southern Utah, and the rugged landscapes of southwestern Colorado. These journeys were remarkable not just for their scope, but for the fact that he was doing them alone, with minimal equipment, in an era when wilderness rescue was virtually non-existent. During his travels, Everett immersed himself in the cultures of the Native American tribes he encountered. He learned to speak some Navajo, participated in Hopi religious ceremonies, and developed a deep respect for indigenous ways of life. This cultural exchange influenced both his art and his writing, adding layers of meaning to his work that went beyond simple landscape documentation. He was documenting not just places, but ways of being in the world that were rapidly disappearing. His reputation began to grow within artistic circles. He studied with some of the most prominent artists and photographers of his time, including Ansel Adams, Maynard Dixon, Dorothea Lange, and Edward Weston. These mentors recognized something special in the young man, a combination of artistic talent and fearless exploration that was rare even among experienced artists. They encouraged his work and helped him develop techniques that would serve him well in the harsh conditions of desert photography and painting. But Everett was driven by more than artistic ambition. His writings reveal someone searching for something deeper, a kind of spiritual connection with the natural world that he believed could only be found through solitude and hardship. He wrote extensively about his desire to live authentically, to strip away the artificial constraints of modern society, and discover what remained when all pretense was removed. This philosophy would ultimately lead him to make choices that many considered reckless, but which he saw as essential to his very existence. In 1934, at the age of 20, Everett embarked on what would become his final expedition. He had spent the earlier part of the year working with archaeologists from the University of California, helping to document ancient cliff dwellings and petroglyphs in the Four Corners region. This work had deepened his fascination with the area around Escalante, Utah, a region of incredible beauty and equally incredible danger. The landscape around Escalante is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Massive sandstone formations rise from the desert floor like ancient cathedrals, their red and orange walls carved by millions of years of wind and water into impossible shapes. Hidden within these formations are thousands of slot canyons, narrow passages that can be only a few feet wide, but hundreds of feet deep. These canyons are places of extraordinary beauty, where filtered sunlight creates an almost otherworldly atmosphere, but they are also death traps for the unwary. Flash floods can fill them with raging water in minutes, and their narrow confines make escape virtually impossible. It was into this landscape that Everett Roos rode in November 1934, accompanied only by 2 burros that carried his supplies and art materials. He had told his parents that he would be out of contact for several months, a common arrangement given the remoteness of the areas he intended to explore. What no one knew was that this time, the wilderness would keep him forever. The last confirmed sighting of Everett came from sheepherders who saw him near the town of Escalante in mid-November. He appeared to be in good health and spirits. His burros were well loaded with supplies, and he seemed confident about his planned route into the backcountry. He mentioned to the herders that he intended to explore the area around Davis Gulch, a remote canyon system that even today requires considerable skill and preparation to navigate safely. After that encounter, Everett Roos simply vanished. No distress signals, no emergency messages, no trace of his passage beyond the small campsite that would later be discovered in Davis Gulch. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed him whole, leaving behind only questions that would haunt searchers for generations to come. When Everett failed to return or send word by February 1935, his parents grew increasingly concerned. They contacted the postmaster in Escalante, Utah, asking if there had been any word from their son. The inquiry prompted the formation of the first search party, led by Jennings Allen, a local commissioner who understood the dangers of the surrounding wilderness. What they found only deepened the mystery. In Davis Gulch, searchers discovered Everett's 2 burros, alive and apparently well cared for. They were grazing peacefully in a natural corral that someone had constructed from rocks and brush. Nearby, they found clear evidence of a campsite, with items that clearly belonged to Everett. The word Nemo, meaning no one, in Latin, was also the name of the mysterious captain in Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a character who had renounced civilization to live beneath the ocean's surface. But of Everett himself, there was no trace. His body was not found, nor were there any signs of struggle or violence. His art supplies were present, but no recent artwork was discovered that might provide clues about his final days. The careful arrangement of his camp suggested that whatever had happened to him had occurred while he was away from his base, perhaps on one of the day hikes he regularly took to scout new locations for his art. The initial search efforts were hampered by the technology and techniques available in 1935. Search parties on horseback covered what ground they could, But the terrain around Davis Gulch includes thousands of slot canyons, hidden alcoves, and remote areas that would have been impossible to search thoroughly. An aerial survey was conducted, with planes flying at 12,000 feet over the search area. But this was largely ineffective given the narrow nature of the canyons and the primitive state of aerial search techniques at the time. As weeks turned to months without any sign of Everett, theories began to emerge about what might have happened to him. Some suggested that he had suffered an accident while exploring one of the many slot canyons in the area, perhaps falling or becoming trapped in a narrow passage. Others proposed that he might have encountered hostile individuals, possibly cattle rustlers or others operating outside the law in the remote region. Still others wondered if Everett had deliberately disappeared, perhaps to start a new life among the Native American communities he had come to know and respect. The mystery deepened over the years as additional searches failed to turn up any definitive evidence of Everett's fate. His disappearance became one of the most famous unsolved cases in the American West, inspiring books, documentaries, songs, and countless amateur investigations. He became a symbol of the romantic wanderer, the artistic soul who had chosen the purity of wilderness over the compromises of civilization. In the decades following his disappearance, Everett's reputation grew far beyond what it had been during his lifetime. His artwork, once seen by only a few collectors and gallery visitors, was recognized as capturing something essential about the American West during a time of great change. His writings, compiled from letters and journal entries, were published in books that found audiences among artists, environmentalists, and anyone drawn to stories of adventure and self-discovery. But perhaps more importantly, Everett became an inspiration to countless individuals who felt the same pull toward wild places and authentic experiences. His philosophy of living intensely, of choosing hardship and beauty over comfort and conformity, resonated with generations of Americans who felt constrained by conventional expectations. He represented the possibility that another way of life was possible, one based on direct experience of the natural world, rather than the artificial constructs of modern society. The search for Everett Roos never truly ended. Over the decades, numerous expeditions have attempted to solve the mystery of his disappearance. Modern search techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, drone surveys, and sophisticated GPS mapping, have been employed to examine areas that were inaccessible to earlier searchers. Each new search has added pieces to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains elusive. One of the most significant developments came in 2009, when remains discovered on Comb Ridge near Bluff, Utah, were initially identified as possibly belonging to Everett. DNA testing seemed to confirm the identification, and for a brief moment, it appeared that the mystery had finally been solved. However, subsequent analysis revealed problems with the DNA testing methodology, and the identification was retracted. The remains were determined to be those of a Native American individual, not Everett Roos. This false identification highlighted both the intense interest that Everett's case continues to generate and the difficulties inherent in solving mysteries that are nearly a century old. The physical evidence has been scattered by decades of weather, flash floods, and the natural processes that constantly reshape the desert landscape. Any remains that might have existed have likely been moved far from their original location or destroyed entirely by the harsh environment. The most widely accepted theory among serious researchers is that Everett suffered an accident while exploring one of the many dangerous areas around Davis Gulch. The region is filled with unstable rock formations, hidden drop-offs, and slot canyons that can become death traps during flash floods. Even an experienced outdoorsman like Everett could have been caught off guard by a sudden rock fall, a hidden crevasse, or a flash flood that struck without warning. The fact that his burrows were found safe and well cared for suggests that whatever happened to Everett occurred relatively quickly and without warning. If he had been injured or trapped somewhere within walking distance of his camp, he likely would have been able to return, or at least signal for help. The careful arrangement of his campsite indicates that he had not been planning to leave permanently, ruling out theories of deliberate disappearance. Flash floods represent perhaps the most likely explanation for Everett's fate. The slot canyons around Davis Gulch are notorious for their flash flood potential, with narrow walls that can channel water from storms occurring miles away. These floods can occur with little warning, turning peaceful exploration routes into raging torrents within minutes. If Everett had been caught in such a flood while exploring a narrow canyon, his body could have been carried far from the search area and buried under tons of debris. The seasonal timing of his disappearance also supports this theory. November in the Utah desert can bring sudden weather changes, including the kind of intense but localized storms that create flash flooding conditions. Everett's extensive experience in the region would have made him aware of this danger, but even experienced desert travelers can be caught off guard by the speed and violence of desert storms. Another factor that complicates any search efforts is the ongoing geological activity in the region. The sandstone formations around Davis Gulch are constantly changing as wind and water continue their erosive work. Rockfalls are common, and entire cliff faces can collapse without warning. If Everett's remains were initially visible or accessible, they may have been buried by subsequent geological events. The remote nature of the area also means that even if remains were visible, they might not be discovered for decades or even centuries. Much of the terrain around Davis Gulch sees very few visitors even today, despite improved access roads and modern navigation equipment. In 1934, these areas were virtually inaccessible, except to someone with Everett's level of experience and determination. Yet despite the logical explanations for his disappearance, the mystery of Everett Roos continues to capture imaginations and inspire new theories. Some researchers have suggested that he may have encountered hostile individuals in the remote area, perhaps cattle rustlers or others engaged in illegal activities who saw him as a threat. However, this theory is complicated by the fact that his valuable art supplies and equipment were left undisturbed at his campsite. Others have proposed that Everett may have deliberately disappeared, perhaps to join a Native American community or to start a new life under a different identity. His deep respect for indigenous cultures and his fluency in Navajo make this theory superficially plausible, but it conflicts with his close relationship with his family and his regular correspondence with them throughout his previous expeditions. The inscription Nemo 1934 found near his campsite has been interpreted by some as evidence that Everett was planning his own disappearance. The reference to Jules Verne's Captain Nemo, a character who had rejected civilization for a life of isolation, could be seen as Everett's way of announcing his intention to vanish permanently from the conventional world. However, this interpretation requires accepting that he would willingly cause his family the anguish of not knowing his fate, something that seems inconsistent with his character as revealed in his letters and journal entries. The enduring appeal of Everett's story lies not just in the mystery of his disappearance, but in what his life represented. In an era of increasing urbanization and technological advancement, he chose a path that led away from comfort and security toward risk and authentic experience. His writings reveal someone who understood that true fulfillment could not be found in the accumulation of possessions or the achievement of conventional success, but only through direct engagement with the natural world and the challenges it presented. His artistic work captured not just the visual beauty of the landscapes he explored, but something deeper about the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. His prints and paintings show an understanding of how light and shadow, form and space can evoke emotional responses that transcend mere representation. He was documenting not just places, but states of being, moments of connection between the human spirit and the vast forces that shape the earth. Today, nearly 90 years after his disappearance, Everett Roos continues to inspire artists, writers, environmentalists, and adventurers who feel the same pull toward wild places and authentic experiences. His story has become part of the mythology of the American West, a reminder that there are still mysteries in the world, still places where the conventional rules don't apply, still individuals willing to risk everything in pursuit of something greater than themselves. The landscape where he vanished remains largely unchanged from his time. The red rock canyons of southern Utah still offer the same combination of beauty and danger that drew him there in 1934. Visitors to the area can still see the inscription he left behind, Still imagine him setting up his easel to capture the play of light on sandstone walls. Still wonder what thoughts occupied his mind during those final days in the wilderness. Modern searchers continue to explore the remote corners of the region, hoping to find some trace of the young artist who vanished so completely. New technologies offer possibilities that earlier searchers could never have imagined, but the harsh environment and the passage of time have made the task increasingly difficult. Each year that passes makes it less likely that definitive answers will ever be found. Perhaps that is as it should be. Everett Roos chose a life that was defined by mystery, by the unknown, by the willingness to venture into places where maps ended and certainty disappeared. But what drove Everett Roos deeper into the desert's embrace wasn't just artistic inspiration or wanderlust. It was something more profound, something that set him apart from other young men of his generation. While most 20-year-olds in 1934 were concerned with finding steady work during the Great Depression, Everett was constructing an entirely different philosophy of existence. His letters reveal a young man grappling with questions that would plague philosophers for centuries. In one particularly striking passage written to his friend Bill Jacobs, Everett confessed, "I have been thinking more and more that I shall always be a lone wanderer of the wildernesses. God, how the trail lures me! You cannot comprehend its resistless fascination for me. After all, the lone trail is the best." This wasn't mere teenage romanticism. Everett was articulating a worldview that placed authentic experience above social convention, beauty above security, and freedom above comfort. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Each expedition pushed Everett further from conventional society and deeper into his own mythology. By 1932, he had begun signing his letters and inscribing his artwork with various names: Christopher Johnson, Lan Rameau, and finally, most mysteriously, Nemo. The choice wasn't arbitrary. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's enigmatic submarine commander, was a man who had rejected civilization entirely, creating his own underwater kingdom where he answered to no authority but his own conscience. Everett's adoption of the Nemo persona revealed the depth of his alienation from mainstream American culture. In letters to his family, he wrote, "The beauty of this country is becoming part of me. I feel more detached from life and somehow gentler. I have some good friends here, but no one who really understands why I am here or what I do." This sense of isolation wasn't entirely self-imposed. Everett's unconventional lifestyle made him an object of curiosity and sometimes suspicion in the small towns where he occasionally resupplied. Local newspapers would sometimes write about the strange young artist who traveled with pack animals and lived off the land. Some viewed him as a harmless eccentric, others as a potential troublemaker. Few understood that they were witnessing someone attempting to live according to principles that challenged the very foundations of their society. The equipment Everett carried reflected his unique approach to wilderness travel. Unlike modern backpackers with their lightweight synthetic materials and freeze-dried meals, Everett traveled with the tools of both survival and creation. His pack animals carried not just food and camping gear, but watercolors, brushes, carving tools, and paper. He was simultaneously explorer and documentarian, adventurer and artist, creating a record of landscapes that few others would ever see. His technique was distinctive and purposeful. Rather than simply passing through beautiful locations, Everett would establish semi-permanent camps that allowed him to truly inhabit a place. He would spend days or weeks in a single spot, creating multiple works of art, writing extensive journal entries, and developing what he called an intimate relationship with the landscape. This wasn't tourism or even conventional exploration. It was an attempt to merge completely with the natural world. The psychological dimensions of Everett's quest become more apparent when examining his correspondence from the final year of his life. His letters reveal increasing preoccupation with themes of transformation and transcendence. To his brother Waldo, he wrote, "I have seen almost more beauty than I can bear. The sculptured stone, the delicate arch, the cliff dwellings of those who came before." This language suggests someone approaching a profound psychological or spiritual crisis. Everett was pushing the boundaries of human experience, seeking something that might not be attainable through conventional means. His art from this period shows increasing abstraction and emotional intensity, as though he was trying to capture not just the appearance of the landscape, but its essential spirit. The relationship between Everett and the indigenous peoples he encountered adds another layer of complexity to his story. Unlike many white explorers of his era, who viewed Native Americans as obstacles or curiosities, Everett approached them with genuine respect and desire for understanding. He spent considerable time learning Navajo language and customs, participating in ceremonies when invited, and developing friendships that transcended cultural barriers. Some historians suggest that Everett's deep connection with Native American culture may have influenced his ultimate disappearance. The traditional Navajo concept of beauty walking, of living in harmony with the natural world, aligned closely with Everett's own philosophy. There were rumors, never substantiated, that he had been adopted into a Navajo family or had chosen to live permanently within their community. The evidence, however, suggests a different conclusion. Everett's final letters show no indication of planning to abandon his identity or join another culture. Instead, they reveal someone pushing himself toward an increasingly dangerous edge, both physically and psychologically. His writing became more mystical, more abstract, filled with references to dissolution and transformation that read like prophecies of his own fate. The camp that searchers discovered in Davis Gulch tells its own story. Everything was meticulously organized, exactly as Everett would have left it for a day hike or artistic expedition. His burrows were healthy and well cared for, suggesting he had been present until very recently. Personal items remained undisturbed, ruling out robbery or violence. The scene suggested someone who had simply walked away from his camp and never returned. But the inscription found nearby, Nemo, 1934, carved into the sandstone, adds a haunting dimension to the mystery. Was this Everett's final signature, a deliberate farewell to his old identity? Or was it simply another of the many inscriptions he left throughout his travels, marking his passage through the landscape? The location of the carving, away from his camp but not hidden, suggests intentionality rather than casual marking. The timing of Everett's disappearance also holds significance. November in the Utah desert can be treacherous, with sudden weather changes that can trap even experienced travelers. Flash floods, unexpected snowstorms, and extreme temperature variations make late autumn particularly dangerous for solo travel. Everett, despite his experience, may have underestimated the risks or been caught off guard by rapidly changing conditions. Yet those who knew Everett best insisted that he was too careful and experienced to fall victim to ordinary hazards. His family and friends pointed to his meticulous planning, his intimate knowledge of desert survival, and his almost supernatural ability to navigate difficult terrain. If conventional dangers had claimed him, they argued, his remains should have been discoverable by the extensive search efforts that followed his disappearance. The search for Everett Ruiz became one of the most intensive missing person investigations in Utah history. Professional searchers, volunteers, and even aircraft scoured thousands of square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in North America. They found traces of his passage, campsites he had used, and artwork he had created, but never the man himself or any definitive evidence of his fate. Some searchers reported an almost supernatural quality to their efforts, as though the landscape itself was concealing Everett's final resting place. Experienced trackers spoke of following clear trails that would suddenly vanish, of finding evidence that seemed to lead nowhere, of sensing a presence that remained always just beyond discovery. The mystery of Everett Ruiz has endured not just because of the circumstances of his disappearance, but because of what he represented. He embodied a uniquely American archetype, the individual who rejects society's expectations in pursuit of authentic experience. His story resonates with anyone who has felt the pull of the wilderness, the desire to escape civilization's constraints and discover what lies beyond the mapped and familiar. In many ways, Everett achieved exactly what he sought. He became one with the landscape he loved, disappearing so completely into the desert that he became part of its mythology. Whether his end came through accident, design, or something more mysterious, he had succeeded in his quest to live more intensely than others dared. The continuing fascination with Everett Roos speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. His story reminds us that there are still mysteries in the world, still places where the individual can vanish completely and become legend. In an age of satellite tracking and digital surveillance, the idea that someone could simply disappear into the wilderness retains a powerful romantic appeal. More than 90 years after his disappearance, people still venture into the Utah desert hoping to solve the mystery of what happened to Everett Roos. They follow his routes, visit his campsites, and search for clues that might finally explain his fate. But perhaps the real truth is that Everett found exactly what he was looking for. The inscription, Nemo 1934, becomes more haunting when you understand what it might have meant to Everett. Captain Nemo, the mysterious explorer from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was a character who deliberately chose isolation from civilization, living by his own code in the depths of the ocean. For someone like Everett, who had written about preferring the deep peace of the wild to the discontent bred by cities, this literary reference feels deeply personal, almost prophetic. The word Nemo itself means nobody in Latin, which adds another layer of meaning. Was Everett suggesting he was becoming nobody to the civilized world? Or was it simply the romantic signature of a young man who identified with literature's most famous voluntary exile? The inscription was carved near his final campsite, a place where his donkeys grazed peacefully for months after his disappearance, as if waiting for their master's return. What makes the inscription particularly significant is its permanence. Unlike his other belongings, which could have been scattered by weather or animals, this carving was meant to last. It suggests deliberation, a moment when Everett took time to mark his presence in that remote canyon. The year 1934 confirms it was made during his final expedition, but the exact timing remains unknown. Did he carve it upon arrival, marking his territory like explorers before him? Or was it one of his last acts, a final statement carved when he sensed something was wrong? The theories surrounding Everett's fate have evolved over the decades, but they generally fall into several categories. The most romantic suggests he chose to disappear, perhaps taking a Navajo bride and living out his days in deliberate obscurity. This theory draws support from his deep interest in Native American culture and his documented desire to escape conventional society. He had learned to speak Navajo, participated in Hopi religious ceremonies, and wrote extensively about his fascination with indigenous ways of life. However, this romantic notion faces significant obstacles. Everett maintained regular correspondence with his family throughout his travels, and there's no evidence he was planning a permanent break from his old life. His parents were supportive of his unconventional path, even funding his expeditions when his art sales fell short. Why would someone with such understanding family support feel the need to fake his death rather than simply announcing his new life? The suicide theory, while disturbing to contemplate, has been proposed by some researchers. They point to certain melancholic passages in his writing and his seeming obsession with death in the wilderness. Some interpret these words as a death wish, a young man's romantic notion of dying beautifully in the wild rather than fading away in civilization. Yet this interpretation seems to misunderstand Everett's character. His writings, while acknowledging the dangers of wilderness life, celebrate rather than mourn those risks. He wrote extensively about the joy he found in solitude, the spiritual fulfillment he discovered in nature, and his plans for future expeditions. These don't sound like the words of someone contemplating suicide, but rather someone who had found his calling and intended to pursue it for years to come. The murder theory emerged decades later when an elderly Navajo woman claimed that Everett had been killed by cattle rustlers who wanted his donkeys. This story led to the discovery of remains on Combe Ridge in 2008, which briefly appeared to solve the mystery. Initial DNA analysis suggested the bones belonged to Everett, creating international headlines and seemingly closing one of the American West's most enduring mysteries. However, Subsequent testing by the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory concluded definitively that the remains were not Everett's, but rather those of a Native American individual, probably dating to an earlier period. This false identification highlighted both the intense desire to solve Everett's mystery and the dangers of rushing to conclusions. The announcement that his remains had been found made national news, only to be retracted months later when more rigorous testing was completed. The incident created lasting controversy in the community of Everett enthusiasts, with some continuing to believe the original identification despite the scientific evidence to the contrary. The most prosaic, but perhaps most likely explanation is that Everett suffered an accident. The desert canyon country where he disappeared is unforgiving terrain, filled with hidden dangers that can kill even experienced outdoorsmen. Flash floods can sweep through narrow canyons with little warning, carrying away everything in their path. Cliff faces that appear stable can crumble without notice. A simple fall in a remote location, far from any help, could easily prove fatal. What makes this theory compelling is the condition of Everett's campsite when it was discovered. His donkeys were healthy and well cared for, his equipment was intact, and there were no signs of struggle or hurried departure. This suggests that whatever happened to Everett occurred away from his base camp, perhaps during a day hike to explore petroglyphs or cliff dwellings in the area. In such terrain, a body could easily become wedged in a narrow slot canyon or buried under rockfall, remaining hidden indefinitely. The timing of his disappearance also supports the accident theory. November in southern Utah can bring sudden weather changes, with freezing temperatures at night and the possibility of early winter storms. An injury that might be survivable in warmer weather could prove fatal when combined with exposure to cold. Everett was experienced, but even the most skilled outdoorsman can be caught off guard by a combination of bad weather and bad luck. The search efforts, while extensive for their time, were limited by 1930s technology and techniques. The aerial survey conducted at 12,000 feet would have been largely useless for spotting human remains in the maze of canyons below. The ground searches, conducted by local volunteers rather than trained search and rescue teams, covered only a fraction of the vast territory where Everett might have traveled. In the decades since, flash floods and erosion have continued to reshape the landscape, potentially moving or burying any remains beyond recovery. Modern search efforts have been more sophisticated but no more successful. The area where Everett disappeared has been extensively hiked and explored by thousands of people over the past 90 years, yet no definitive trace of him has been found. This suggests either that his remains are in a location so remote or inaccessible that they've never been discovered, or that they were destroyed or scattered by natural forces long ago. The enduring fascination with Everett Roos stems from more than just the mystery of his disappearance. His story represents something that speaks to the human spirit across generations. The courage to follow your dreams regardless of social expectations, the willingness to embrace solitude and hardship in pursuit of beauty and truth, and the romantic notion of losing yourself completely in the wild places of the world. His writings reveal a young man of extraordinary sensitivity and intelligence, someone who found in the desert landscape a spiritual home that civilization could never provide. The legend of Everett Roos continues to evolve through every retelling, every theory, every poem discovered in his weathered journals. Yet perhaps what makes his story so enduring isn't the mystery of his disappearance, but what his life represented in those brief 20 years he walked among us. Picture this young man in 1934, barely out of his teens, making his way through landscapes that would challenge seasoned explorers today. While his contemporaries were settling into conventional lives, finding steady work, starting families, Everett was carving his own path through slot canyons and across endless desert vistas. He wasn't running from something. He was running towards something most of us spend our entire lives searching for. The inscription he left behind, Nemo, 1934, speaks volumes about his mindset in those final documented moments. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's fictional explorer who rejected the civilized world to live beneath the waves in his submarine Nautilus. The parallel wasn't coincidental. Everett saw himself as someone who had found a different way to exist, Someone who had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in sunrises witnessed from canyon rims and nights spent under star-drunk skies. His letters home reveal a young man who had already grasped something many never understand. These weren't the romantic musings of someone playing at adventure. This was someone who had tasted authentic existence and found everything else wanting. The theories surrounding his fate have multiplied over the decades, like desert wildflowers after rain. Did he fall into one of those narrow slot canyons where flash floods could carry away any trace? Did he succumb to exposure during an unexpected weather turn? Some whisper about cattle rustlers or conflicts with local inhabitants. Others suggest he staged his own disappearance to start fresh, perhaps with a Navajo bride, living out his days in deliberate obscurity. The DNA controversy of 2009 only deepened the mystery. When remains were discovered near Bluff, Utah, initial testing suggested they might belong to Everett. Headlines proclaimed the decades-old mystery solved. But subsequent analysis revealed the truth was more complex. The remains were likely of Native American origin, and the rush to judgment had led to flawed conclusions. The case remained open, the mystery intact. Yet maybe that's exactly as it should be. Consider what we know for certain. His donkeys were found healthy and well cared for, grazing peacefully in the makeshift corral he'd constructed. His camp showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure. His gear remained organized, suggesting whatever happened occurred while he was away from his base, perhaps on one of his daily explorations into the surrounding canyon country. The search efforts of 1935 were valiant, but limited by the technology and techniques of their era. Flying at 12,000 feet in primitive aircraft, hoping to spot traces of a lone wanderer in that vast landscape, was optimistic at best. Even today, with satellite imagery, GPS tracking, and sophisticated search and rescue operations, people vanish without a trace in that same unforgiving terrain. Davis Gulch and the surrounding Glen Canyon country represent some of the most challenging wilderness in North America. It's a landscape that can shift from breathtaking beauty to lethal hazard in moments. Flash floods roar through narrow passages with the force of freight trains. Loose rock gives way underfoot. Weather systems can drop temperatures 40 degrees in an hour. For all his experience and passion for the wilderness, Everett was still a 20-year-old human being subject to the same physical limitations as anyone else. But here's what makes his story transcendent rather than merely tragic. Everett lived more intensely in his brief 2 decades than most people manage in 80 years. He followed his authentic desires rather than society's expectations. He chose beauty over security, adventure over comfort, truth over convention. He embodied what Henry David Thoreau meant when he wrote about living deliberately. His poetry reveals someone who understood that life's meaning isn't found in its duration, but in its depth. These words, written before his final journey, suggest someone who had made peace with whatever price his chosen path might demand. The Navajo people speak of places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where spirits can step across from one existence to another. Perhaps that's what happened to Everett Roos. Perhaps in those red rock canyons where ancient peoples once lived and dreamed, he found a doorway to something beyond our understanding. Perhaps his disappearance wasn't an ending but a transformation. Modern search efforts continue sporadically. Hikers occasionally report finding weathered artifacts that might have belonged to him. Archaeologists studying prehistoric sites sometimes wonder if bones they've discovered could be his. But after 90 years, the desert has likely claimed any physical evidence, scattering it across arroyos and burying it beneath shifting sands. What remains is something more durable than bones or artifacts. Everett Roos lives on as an archetype, a reminder that there are other ways to exist, other values to pursue. His story speaks to everyone who has ever felt the pull of wild places, who has questioned whether the conventional path is the only path, who has wondered what might happen if they simply walked away from expectations and toward their dreams. Artists and writers continue to find inspiration in his example. Musicians compose songs about his journey. Filmmakers attempt to capture his spirit. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from those who follow their own version of his path, who choose their own difficult trails over well-paved highways, who seek their own star-sprinkled skies over manufactured roofs. The mystery of what happened to Everett Roos may never be solved. In our age of surveillance and connectivity, his ability to simply vanish seems almost impossible. But that impossibility is part of his enduring appeal. He represents a time when it was still possible to disappear completely, to step outside the boundaries of recorded existence and into something unknown. Whether he died in those canyons or lived out his days in deliberate anonymity, whether his bones rest in some hidden crevice or were scattered by ancient floods, his essential message remains clear. Life is meant to be lived fully, authentically, without apology for choosing beauty over security or adventure over comfort. In a world increasingly dominated by digital connections and virtual experiences, Everett Roos reminds us of what we lose when we stop seeking direct contact with the natural world. His disappearance marks not just the end of one young man's journey, but the closing of an era when such journeys were still possible. The Red Rock country where he vanished continues to call to adventurers and dreamers. Some go seeking traces of Everett himself. Others go seeking what he sought, that deeper connection to landscape and to their own authentic selves. All find themselves changed by the experience of standing where he stood, seeing vistas that moved him to poetry, feeling the same pull toward horizons that promise revelation. Perhaps that's his true legacy. Not the mystery of his disappearance, but the inspiration of his living. In choosing to follow his dreams into the wilderness, in refusing to settle for a life that felt too small, in embracing beauty and mystery over safety and certainty, Everett Roos blazed a trail that others can still follow. His ghost walks beside everyone who chooses the difficult path, who seeks the star-sprinkled sky, who believes that some dreams are worth any price. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its promises. The search for Everett intensified as the mystery deepened. What began as a routine missing person case in the Utah desert transformed into something far more perplexing. The discovery of his well-maintained camp and healthy donkeys suggested something had gone terribly wrong, but the absence of any struggle or disturbance painted a confusing picture. The inscription, Nemo 1934, carved into the sandstone, became a focal point of investigation. Some theorized it referenced Captain Nemo, the fictional explorer from Jules Verne's novels, a character who embodied the spirit of adventure and solitary exploration that defined Everett's own journey. Others believed it might have been a coded message or simply a reflection of his poetic nature. The word Nemo itself means nobody in Latin, adding another layer of mystery to his final known act. Local Navajo communities were questioned extensively about any encounters with the young explorer. Several reported seeing a lone white man with pack animals in the weeks before his disappearance. But the vast desert landscape made precise locations and timelines difficult to establish. The Navajo had their own theories about what might have befallen the wanderer, speaking of dangerous spirits that inhabited certain canyons and the unpredictable nature of flash floods that could erase all traces of human presence. The geology of the region itself became a crucial factor in understanding Everett's fate. Davis Gulch and the surrounding canyon country featured numerous slot canyons, narrow passages carved by water over millennia. These geological formations created deadly traps for the unwary. A single misstep could send someone tumbling into a crevice so narrow and deep that recovery would be impossible. The sandstone walls, constantly eroded by wind and water, could collapse without warning, creating natural tombs that might never be discovered. Weather records from November 1934 revealed that the region had experienced unusual storm activity in the days following Everett's last known position. Temperatures dropped dramatically, and several flash floods were reported in nearby watersheds. For someone caught in the open, even with considerable wilderness experience, such conditions could prove fatal within hours. The desert's reputation for extreme temperature swings meant that what might be pleasant hiking weather during the day could become life-threatening once the sun disappeared. The search parties that followed in 1935 faced their own challenges. The technology of the era limited their effectiveness to visual searches on foot or horseback. The aerial survey conducted at 12,000 feet, while innovative for its time, was largely symbolic rather than practical. From such heights, even a large camp would appear as a tiny speck, easily missed among the vast expanse of red rock and desert vegetation. As months passed without discovery, theories began to multiply. Some suggested Everett had deliberately vanished, perhaps to escape the pressures of family expectations or societal norms. His letters home had occasionally hinted at a desire to live completely free from civilization's constraints. The possibility that he had successfully integrated into a Native American community, adopting their ways and abandoning his former identity, captured the imagination of romantics and adventurers. Others proposed more sinister explanations. The remote location attracted various unsavory characters, from cattle rustlers to bootleggers operating during the final years of Prohibition. A young man traveling alone with valuable equipment and healthy animals might have presented an irresistible target. Yet the lack of disturbance at his camp and the care shown to his donkeys suggested that if foul play had occurred, it happened away from his established base. The psychological profile that emerged from Everett's writings and correspondence painted a complex picture. His poetry revealed a young man grappling with profound questions about existence, purpose, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. Some passages hinted at a fascination with death and transcendence that concerned those who knew him well. Lines like, "Say that I starved, that I was lost and weary," seemed almost prophetic in retrospect. His artistic temperament and philosophical nature set him apart from typical missing persons cases. Everett wasn't simply a hiker who had gotten lost. He was a seeker pursuing something beyond conventional understanding. This spiritual dimension to his quest made it difficult to predict his actions or motivations using standard logic. He might have taken risks that others would consider foolhardy, driven by an inner vision that prioritized experience over safety. The investigation revealed the challenges of wilderness search and rescue in the 1930s. Communication was limited to mail service, often delayed by weeks in remote areas. Search coordination relied on word of mouth and chance encounters rather than systematic planning. The vastness of the search area, combined with limited manpower and resources, meant that large sections of potentially relevant terrain remained unexplored. Local residents shared stories passed down through oral tradition about other disappearances in the region. The desert had claimed many victims over the years, from prospectors to pioneers, leaving behind only fragments of their stories. Everett's case differed in the attention it attracted and the documentation of his final journey, but the ultimate outcome remained frustratingly similar. The donkeys themselves provided crucial evidence about the timeline and circumstances of Everett's disappearance. Their healthy condition after months alone suggested they had been well cared for until recently and had access to adequate water and forage. The makeshift corral indicated Everett had intended to return, ruling out suicide or deliberate abandonment. Their behavior when discovered showed no signs of trauma or distress that might indicate they had witnessed violence. As the search efforts gradually diminished and hope faded, Everett Roos began his transformation from missing person to legend. His story resonated with a generation coming of age during the Great Depression, offering an alternative to conventional paths of security and conformity. As we delve deeper into Everett's disappearance, what emerges is a portrait of a young man whose vanishing has become more than just an unsolved mystery. It's become a meditation on the very nature of seeking, of belonging, and of the price we sometimes pay for authenticity in a world that often demands conformity. The search efforts that followed Everett's disappearance reveal both the dedication of those who cared about him and the harsh realities of the terrain he chose to call home. The initial search party, led by Jennings Allen, found his donkeys in remarkable condition. These animals, well cared for and healthy, grazing peacefully in a makeshift corral near Davis Gulch, told a story of someone who had planned to return. This wasn't the scene of panic or desperation. It was the scene of routine interrupted. What's particularly striking about these early search efforts is how they captured the imagination of an entire community. Here was a young man who had chosen to live differently, to pursue beauty and meaning in places most people would never venture. His disappearance wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a symbol of something larger, something that spoke to dreams deferred and paths not taken. The aerial searches that followed, conducted from 12,000 feet above the canyon country, represent both the hope and the futility that would come to characterize decades of efforts to solve this mystery. From that height, the landscape below would have appeared as an abstract painting, all red rock and shadow, beautiful but revealing nothing of its secrets. The searchers were looking for traces of a man who had deliberately chosen to make himself small against the vastness of the desert. But it's the ground searches that really tell the story of how deeply Everett's disappearance affected those who knew this country. These were men who understood the dangers of slot canyons and flash floods, who knew how quickly the desert could claim someone. They rode horseback through terrain that could break bones and spirits, following leads that more often than not led nowhere. Their dedication speaks to something Everett himself would have understood, the way wild places create bonds between those who venture into them. The inscription found near his camp, Nemo 1934, has become one of the most analyzed clues in American wilderness mystery. Carved into stone in an area so remote that it might not have been seen by human eyes for months or years, it carries the weight of intention. The reference to Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's mysterious submarine commander who chose exile over conventional society, seems almost too perfect, too literary for coincidence. Captain Nemo was a character who possessed both great knowledge and great sorrow, who found in the depths of the ocean a refuge from a world he could no longer tolerate. For Everett, who had written extensively about preferring the deep peace of the wild to the discontent bred by cities, the parallel is haunting. Was this inscription a final artistic statement, a way of signing his name to the wilderness itself? The timing of the inscription is significant too. By 1934, Everett had been wandering for several years, long enough to understand both the rewards and the costs of his chosen lifestyle. His letters from this period show a young man grappling with isolation, with the tension between his love of solitude and his need for meaningful connection. The Nemo inscription might represent his resolution of that tension, his final embrace of the exile's path. What makes Everett's case particularly compelling is how it intersects with broader questions about identity and belonging in Depression-era America. Here was a time when traditional paths to success and fulfillment were being questioned, when many young people were looking for alternatives to conventional life. Everett's journey into the wilderness wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger cultural moment of questioning and seeking. His interest in Native American culture adds another layer to this story. At a time when most Americans viewed indigenous peoples through the lens of conquest and assimilation, Everett approached them with genuine curiosity and respect. He learned to speak Navajo, participated in Hopi ceremonies, and seemed to find in Native cultures a model for living that resonated with his own values. This wasn't the romantic primitivism that was popular among some intellectuals of the time, but something deeper, a recognition of different ways of being in relationship with the land. The theory that Everett might have chosen to disappear into Native American communities, perhaps taking a Navajo bride and living out his days in traditional ways, speaks to this aspect of his character. While there's no concrete evidence for this scenario, it captures something essential about who Everett was, someone always looking for more authentic ways of living, more genuine connections between human beings and the natural world. The physical evidence of Everett's final camp tells its own story. Everything was in order, suggesting that whatever happened to him occurred away from his base, during one of his daily explorations of the surrounding canyons. His supplies were adequate, his equipment well maintained. This was not the camp of someone overwhelmed by circumstances or unprepared for the challenges of desert life. It was the camp of an experienced wilderness traveler who had simply stepped out for the day and never returned. The condition of his donkeys provides another crucial clue. These animals, found months later in good health, had clearly been cared for right up until Everett's disappearance. Donkeys are hardy creatures, capable of surviving in harsh conditions, But their good condition suggests that Everett's disappearance was sudden and unexpected, not the result of a prolonged struggle with the elements. Modern searches using advanced technology have failed to locate any trace of Everett's remains, despite covering vast areas of the canyon country he loved. This absence of evidence has fueled decades of speculation and theory, but it also points to a simple truth about the landscape where he vanished. This is country that can swallow secrets whole, where flash floods can move boulders the size of automobiles, where a person who falls into the wrong slot canyon might never be found. The various DNA tests conducted on remains found in the region have only added to the mystery rather than resolving it. The case of the remains found on Combe Ridge, initially thought to be Everett's but later determined to be of Native American origin, illustrates how desperately people want to solve this puzzle, and how the desire for closure can sometimes override careful analysis. What emerges from all these failed attempts at resolution is a picture of a mystery that may be fundamentally unsolvable, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the landscape itself has become part of the story. Everett chose to vanish into country that specializes in making things disappear, and in some sense, his disappearance has become the most perfect expression of his philosophy about the relationship between human beings and wild places. The continuing fascination with Everett's story speaks to something deeper than mere curiosity about an unsolved mystery. In an age of constant connectivity and surveillance, the idea of someone simply vanishing, of stepping out of the documented world and into something larger and more mysterious, has an almost mythical appeal. The mystery of Everett Roos represents more than just another missing person case. It embodies the eternal tension between civilization and wilderness, between conformity and the relentless pursuit of authentic experience. As we've seen, Everett wasn't simply a young man who got lost in the desert. He was a seeker, a mystic, someone who understood at 20 years old what many people never grasp in an entire lifetime. That true meaning comes not from accumulating possessions or following prescribed paths, but from direct communion with the raw, untamed world that exists beyond our comfortable boundaries. The inscription he left behind, Nemo, 1934, offers perhaps the most revealing clue to his ultimate fate. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's legendary character, was a man who deliberately rejected civilization, choosing instead the freedom of the unknown depths. Like Nemo, Everett may have reached a point where return to conventional life became impossible. His letters home had grown increasingly distant, more philosophical, as if he was already pulling away from the world that had shaped him. The careful arrangement of his camp, the healthy condition of his donkeys, the absence of any signs of struggle or distress, all suggest someone who made a conscious choice rather than fell victim to random misfortune. But here's what makes Everett's story so hauntingly beautiful and tragic. Whether he died from exposure in some remote canyon, fell victim to an accident, or somehow transcended into a different kind of existence entirely, he achieved something most of us only dream about. He lived completely on his own terms. Every decision he made was guided by an inner compass that pointed not toward security or social approval, but toward beauty, mystery, and truth. His poetry reveals a soul that had already touched something eternal, something that made the ordinary concerns of daily life seem trivial by comparison. The desert Southwest that claimed Everett remains as mysterious and dangerous today as it was in 1934. Those endless canyons, hidden springs, and secret places continue to call to modern seekers just as they called to him. Perhaps that's why his disappearance resonates so powerfully across the decades. In our hyper-connected, over-documented world, the idea of simply vanishing into the wilderness carries an almost mythical appeal. Everett did what many of us fantasize about but lack the courage to attempt. He stepped completely outside the system, beyond the reach of schedules and expectations and social media notifications, into a realm where only the essential remains. The various theories about his fate, from accidental death to voluntary disappearance, all miss the deeper point. Everett Roos had already disappeared long before he entered Davis Gulch that November day in 1934. He had disappeared from the world of compromise and half measures, from the life of quiet desperation that Thoreau warned against. What happened to his physical body in those Utah canyons is almost secondary to the spiritual transformation he had already undergone. He had become something beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations or DNA analysis. The ongoing fascination with his case, the books and songs and pilgrimages to the places where he traveled, speaks to our collective hunger for the kind of authenticity he embodied. In an age of increasing artificiality, where experience is mediated through screens and wilderness is packaged for consumption, Everett represents a pure relationship with the natural world. He reminds us that the desert doesn't care about our plans or our timelines. It operates according to older laws, deeper rhythms that can't be controlled or predicted. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't that Everett Roos vanished without a trace, but that so few people possess his courage to pursue their deepest longings regardless of cost. He understood something that takes most of us decades to learn, if we learn it at all. That life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. That beauty and meaning are found not in safe harbors, but in the willingness to sail toward unknown horizons. That sometimes the only way to truly find yourself is to lose yourself so completely that conventional maps become useless. The desert keeps its secrets. But Everett Roos, in his brief 20 years, discovered treasures that no amount of searching will ever uncover. He found what he was looking for long before he disappeared. Perhaps the message is simpler than we imagine. The mystery of Everett Roos continues to deepen as we explore the most compelling theories about his ultimate fate. Each possibility reveals something profound about the nature of disappearance in the American wilderness and the thin line between intentional vanishing and tragic accident. The suicide theory, while suggested by some investigators, seems fundamentally at odds with everything we know about Everett's character. His letters home burst with enthusiasm for life, wonder at the natural world, and plans for future adventures. This was not a young man consumed by despair, but rather one intoxicated by possibility. His final correspondence spoke of new discoveries, of canyon country that still held secrets waiting to be unveiled. The Colorado River theory specifically seems implausible given Everett's documented swimming abilities and his intimate knowledge of desert waterways. More intriguing is the theory that Everett staged his own disappearance to begin a new life among the Navajo people. He had spent considerable time learning their language, participating in their ceremonies, and developing genuine respect for their culture. The idea of a young romantic, disillusioned with civilization's constraints, choosing to vanish into an indigenous community, has a certain poetic appeal that aligns with Everett's own writings about rejecting conventional society. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's fictional character, was a man who deliberately rejected civilization, choosing to live beyond society's reach in his submarine Nautilus. The parallel is striking. Was Everett consciously invoking this literary figure as he prepared to disappear forever into the red rock country he loved? Yet the practical aspects of this theory present challenges. Everett maintained close relationships with his family, sending them detailed letters throughout his travels. His parents were supportive of his unconventional lifestyle, even financially backing his expeditions. Would he have caused them such anguish without some form of communication? The discovery of his well-maintained camp and healthy donkeys suggests he intended to return to that specific location, not abandon his equipment permanently. The accidental death theory remains the most statistically probable explanation, though it offers little comfort to those who prefer their mysteries wrapped in romance rather than tragedy. The canyon country where Everett vanished is a landscape that can kill in countless ways. Flash floods can appear without warning, transforming dry washes into torrents capable of moving house-sized boulders. Slot canyons that provide cool shade can become death traps when storms strike miles away. A simple fall could prove fatal in that remote terrain. Everett was an experienced outdoorsman, but experience cannot prevent every accident. A moment's lapse in attention, a loose rock, a rattlesnake strike, hypothermia during an unexpected storm, any of these could have ended his life far from help. His body might have been washed away by subsequent floods, buried under rockfall, or simply decomposed in some hidden alcove where no searcher would think to look. The 1935 search efforts, while well-intentioned, were hampered by the technology and techniques of their era. Searchers on horseback covered vast areas but could easily miss crucial evidence. The aerial survey conducted at 12,000 feet would have been nearly useless for spotting human remains or small artifacts. Modern search and rescue operations employ sophisticated grid patterns, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal imaging, none of which were available to Everett's searchers. Perhaps most telling is the condition in which his camp was found. Everything suggested a temporary departure, not a permanent abandonment. His donkeys were healthy and well cared for, grazing peacefully in the makeshift corral he had constructed. His equipment was organized and protected. This speaks to someone who expected to return, not someone planning to vanish forever or someone who died in his camp. The timing of his disappearance also suggests accident over intention. November in the Utah desert brings unpredictable weather, sudden temperature drops, and the possibility of early snow in higher elevations. An experienced desert traveler like Everett would know these risks, but even experts can be caught off guard by rapidly changing conditions. There is something almost mythological about Everett's disappearance that transcends the mundane reality of search grids and forensic evidence. He has become a symbol of the eternal human tension between civilization and wildness, between security and freedom, between the known and the unknowable. His story resonates because it represents choices many of us fantasize about, but few have the courage to make. In our modern world of GPS tracking and satellite communication, of social media check-ins and constant connectivity, the idea of simply vanishing into the wilderness seems almost impossible. Everett disappeared into a landscape that could still swallow a person completely, leaving no digital footprint, no electronic trail, no way to be found unless someone happened to stumble across physical evidence. The red rock country of southern Utah remains much as it was in 1934, despite increased visitation and modern amenities. The fundamental character of the landscape, its capacity for both beauty and danger, its ability to inspire and destroy, remains unchanged. Standing in Davis Gulch today, where Everett's camp was discovered, one can easily imagine how a young man could be seduced by the promise of endless exploration, of canyons that lead to other canyons, of secrets hidden in stone. Perhaps the most honest answer to the mystery of Everett Ruiz is that we will never know with certainty what happened to him. The desert has kept his secret for nearly a century and shows no signs of revealing it now. His disappearance has become part of the folklore of the American West, a story that grows more powerful with each retelling, each new theory, each unsuccessful search. What we do know is that Everett Ruiz lived more fully in his 20 years than most people manage in twice that time. He followed his dreams into the wilderness with a purity of purpose that few achieve. Whether he found the transcendence he sought, or simply became another victim of the unforgiving desert matters less than the inspiration his story continues to provide. The young artist who vanished into the Utah desert in 1934 achieved a form of immortality through his disappearance. His name is carved not just in sandstone but in the imagination of everyone who has ever felt the call of wild places, who has stood at the edge of civilization and wondered what lies beyond. In choosing to live authentically, to pursue beauty and truth over security and convention, Everett Ruiz became something more than a missing person. Everett Ruiz had become more than just a missing person. He had transformed into something far more powerful and enduring, a symbol, an archetype, a mirror reflecting our deepest yearnings for authentic existence in an increasingly artificial world. In the decades following his disappearance, his legend grew not despite the mystery, but because of it. The absence of answers allowed each generation to project their own desires onto his story. In the 1960s, he became a patron saint of the counterculture movement, his rejection of conventional life resonating with those seeking alternative paths. His writings were republished, his artwork exhibited, his philosophy quoted by those who saw in him a kindred spirit of rebellion against societal expectations. The environmental movement of the 1970s claimed him as an early voice for wilderness preservation. His passionate descriptions of untouched landscapes and his warnings about civilization's encroachment on nature seemed prophetic. Hikers and backpackers carried his words with them into the backcountry, finding in his prose a perfect articulation of their own connection to wild places. But perhaps most significantly, Everett had become the ultimate embodiment of the romantic ideal of disappearing into nature. In an age of increasing surveillance, social media, and digital footprints, the idea of simply vanishing into the wilderness held an almost magnetic appeal. He represented the possibility of complete escape, of shedding the weight of modern existence, and becoming one with the landscape itself. The inscription Nemo 1934 that searchers found carved into the rock became particularly symbolic. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's mysterious submarine commander, was himself a figure who had rejected society to explore uncharted territories. The name literally means nobody in Latin, suggesting perhaps that Everett had chosen to become nobody, to erase his identity and merge completely with the desert that had called to him so powerfully. This interpretation gained credence when researchers examined his final letters and journal entries more closely. His writing in those last months showed an evolution toward an almost mystical understanding of his relationship with the landscape. He wrote of feeling the desert's pulse, of understanding its ancient rhythms, of sensing that he was approaching some fundamental truth about existence that could only be discovered in absolute solitude. Some scholars began to argue that Everett's disappearance wasn't a tragedy at all, but rather the logical culmination of his life's journey. He had always been moving toward this moment, each expedition taking him deeper into wildness, each return to civilization feeling more jarring and artificial. Perhaps, they suggested, he had simply reached the point where the pull of the wild was stronger than any connection to the human world. The physical evidence seemed to support this theory. His camp was methodically organized, his supplies carefully arranged, his donkeys well cared for and healthy. These weren't the actions of someone in distress or facing an emergency. They suggested deliberate preparation, as if he were setting the stage for a final act of transformation. The timing, too, seemed significant. November in the Utah desert is a season of transition, when the brutal heat of summer gives way to the crystalline clarity of winter. The landscape becomes both more beautiful and more dangerous, demanding complete attention and respect from those who venture into it. For someone seeking a final communion with nature, it would be the perfect time to surrender completely to the wild. Yet even as this romantic interpretation of Everett's fate gained popularity, it raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of his appeal. Was the fascination with his story really about celebrating a life lived authentically? Or was it about the seductive fantasy of escape from responsibility? Did his legend inspire people to engage more deeply with the natural world? Or did it encourage a dangerous romanticization of wilderness that ignored its very real hazards? The search efforts that continued sporadically over the decades revealed both the power of his story and its limitations. Every few years, someone would claim to have found new evidence, a piece of equipment, human remains, a previously unknown inscription. Each discovery would generate fresh interest and speculation, drawing new searchers to the same remote canyons where he had vanished. But these modern searchers were themselves testament to how much the world had changed since 1934. They came equipped with GPS devices, satellite phones, and detailed topographic maps. They had weather forecasting, emergency beacons, and sophisticated rescue services backing them up. The very wilderness that had seemed so vast and unknowable to Everett had been mapped, measured, and made manageable through technology. This technological transformation of the landscape made his disappearance seem even more remarkable. In his time, it was still possible to truly vanish, to step beyond the reach of civilization and become genuinely lost. The desert still held secrets, still contained spaces where a person could exist completely outside the network of human knowledge and control. Today's canyon country, while still spectacular and challenging, is fundamentally different. Satellite imagery has revealed every hidden alcove, every secret spring, every possible route through the maze of stone. GPS coordinates can pinpoint any location to within a few feet. Cell towers extend communication networks into previously unreachable areas. The kind of absolute solitude that Everett sought, and perhaps found, is increasingly rare. This loss of true wilderness, of genuinely unknown spaces, gave his story additional poignancy. He represented not just an individual who had chosen an unconventional path, but perhaps the last generation for whom such complete escape was possible. His disappearance marked the end of an era when the American West still contained blank spaces on the map, places where someone could genuinely lose themselves in the landscape. The environmental movement that claimed him as an early voice for wilderness preservation faced this same paradox. The more they succeeded in protecting wild places, the more those places became managed, regulated, and known. Permits were required, trails were marked, campsites were designated. The very act of preservation inevitably involved a kind of domestication that would have been foreign to Everett's experience of untrammeled wilderness. Yet his influence on wilderness philosophy remained profound. His writings articulated a vision of human relationship with nature that went beyond simple recreation or even conservation. He saw the desert not as a resource to be used or a museum to be preserved, but as a living entity with its own consciousness and purpose. His disappearance became the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a complete surrender to the landscape's will. This mystical dimension of his story attracted not just environmentalists and outdoor enthusiasts, but also artists, writers, and spiritual seekers. They found in his words and his fate a kind of modern mythology that spoke to fundamental questions about meaning, authenticity, and humanity's place in the natural world. His story became a touchstone for anyone grappling with the tension between civilization's comforts and nature's truths. The continuing mystery of his disappearance ensured that his legend remained alive and evolving. Each new generation could discover him afresh, could find in his story reflections of their own struggles with modernity, technology, and the search for authentic experience. He became a kind of eternal wanderer, forever young, forever seeking, forever just beyond the next ridge or around the next bend in the canyon. As the decades passed and the American West became increasingly developed and populated, Everett Roos stood as a reminder of what had been lost, not just in terms of wilderness, but in terms of possibility. His story suggested that there had once been a time when someone could simply walk away from everything, could shed their identity like a snake sheds its skin, and become something entirely new in the embrace of the wild landscape. Whether he died accidentally in some hidden canyon, was murdered by strangers, or chose to disappear completely into a new life among the Navajo, Everett Roos had achieved a kind of immortality through mystery. His absence had become more powerful than his presence ever could have been, his silence more eloquent than any words he might have written had he returned to civilization. In the end, perhaps that was his greatest gift to those who came after, not answers, but questions, not certainty, but possibility, not a destination, but an eternal journey into the heart of wild places and the wild spaces within ourselves. The truth is, the mystery of Everett Roos has never truly been solved, and perhaps that's exactly what makes his story so enduring and so powerful. We've explored the theories, we've examined the evidence, we've considered every possibility from accidental death to deliberate disappearance to voluntary integration into Native American communities. But in the end, the desert has kept its secrets. What we're left with is something far more significant than just another missing person case. Everett Roos represents something that speaks to the deepest part of the human experience. He embodies the eternal tension between the safety of civilization and the raw authenticity of the wilderness. He chose beauty over security, adventure over comfort, and truth over convention. In doing so, he became something larger than himself. The inscription Nemo 1934 that searchers found carved into the rock wasn't just a signature. It was a declaration. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's fictional explorer who chose to live beneath the waves rather than in the corrupt world above, was Everett's way of saying he had found his place in the wild spaces of America. He had become nobody and everybody at once. Think about what Everett accomplished in just 20 years of life. While his peers were settling into conventional careers and traditional paths, he had already explored vast swaths of the American Southwest, created art that captured the soul of the landscape, and written poetry that continues to inspire nearly a century later. He lived with Native American communities, learned their languages, participated in their ceremonies. He had already become a bridge between worlds. The search efforts that followed his disappearance revealed just how deeply he had touched the lives of those who knew him. His parents never stopped believing they might find him. Fellow artists and writers continued to seek him out through their own work. The local communities that had encountered him during his travels joined search parties and shared stories. Even strangers were moved by his story to venture into the desert themselves, looking for traces of the young man who had vanished into the Red Rock country. But here's what's truly remarkable about Everett's legacy. His disappearance didn't end his influence. It amplified it. By vanishing into the landscape he loved, by becoming one with the wilderness that had called to him, he achieved a kind of immortality that few people ever attain. He became a symbol, an archetype, a representation of what it means to live authentically in a world that constantly pressures us to conform. The desert Southwest, where Everett disappeared, has changed dramatically since 1934. The remote canyons he explored are now accessible by modern roads. The cliff dwellings he studied are protected archaeological sites. The vast empty spaces he wandered are crisscrossed with hiking trails and dotted with visitor centers. But something essential about that landscape remains unchanged. It still calls to people who feel trapped by modern life. It still offers the possibility of transformation, of finding something true and permanent in a world of constant change. Every year, thousands of people venture into the Utah desert following in Everett's footsteps. Some are artists seeking inspiration, others are writers looking for stories. Many are simply ordinary people who feel the same restlessness that drove Everett to leave everything behind and seek something more authentic. They're drawn not just by the beauty of the landscape, but by the possibility that they too might find what Everett was looking for. The mystery of his disappearance has inspired countless books, documentaries, songs, and works of art. Musicians have written ballads about the young man who walked into the desert and never came back. Writers have crafted novels exploring what might have happened to him. Filmmakers have created documentaries attempting to solve the puzzle of his fate. But perhaps the most fitting tributes are the quiet ones. The hikers who pause at the edge of a canyon and think about what it means to truly live. The artists who set up their easels in the same spots where Everett once painted. The poets who find in his words permission to pursue their own authentic paths. What Everett understood, and what his story continues to teach us, is that there are different ways to measure a life. Society tells us to accumulate wealth, build careers, establish security, follow predictable paths. But Everett chose intensity over longevity, beauty over safety, authenticity over approval. He compressed more genuine living into 20 years than most people manage in twice that time. His writings reveal someone who was fully awake to the world around him. He noticed the way light fell across canyon walls. He felt the profound silence of desert nights. He understood that there was something sacred in the wild places that couldn't be found in cities or towns. He wasn't running away from life. He was running toward it. The question that haunts everyone who encounters Everett's story is whether his disappearance was the tragic end of a promising life, or the perfect conclusion to a life lived on his own terms. Did he die alone in some remote canyon, his body never to be found? Did he choose to disappear, to shed his old identity and become something new? Did he find the transcendence he was seeking? Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. Perhaps the real power of Everett's story lies not in solving the mystery of his fate, but in understanding what his life represents. He showed us that it's possible to reject the conventional definition of success and create your own meaning. He demonstrated that beauty and truth are worth pursuing, even when they lead us into dangerous territory. He proved that a life lived authentically, even if brief, can have more impact than decades of conformity. The desert where Everett disappeared continues to work its magic on those who venture into it. It strips away pretense, reveals what's essential, and offers the possibility of transformation. Some people emerge from that experience changed, more connected to what really matters. Others, like Everett, never emerge at all. But even their disappearance becomes part of the story, part of the ongoing dialogue between civilization and wilderness, between safety and authenticity, between the known and the unknown. In the end, Everett Roos achieved something that very few people manage. He became a legend not through conquest or accumulation, but through the purity of his search for meaning. He showed us that it's possible to live a life guided by beauty rather than fear, by curiosity rather than convention, by love rather than logic. His story continues to inspire because it reminds us that we all have the capacity to choose adventure over safety, authenticity over approval, and truth over comfort. The red rock country of Utah still holds its secrets. Somewhere in those endless canyons and hidden alcoves, the mystery of Everett Roos remains unsolved. But perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some stories are more powerful when they remain open-ended, when they continue to invite us to imagine, to explore, to search for our own answers. The disappearance of Everett Roos isn't just a historical mystery. The truth about Everett Roos lies not in the physical evidence we've uncovered, but in the deeper psychological and spiritual transformation that likely occurred during his final months in the desert. When we examine the totality of his story, the meticulous care with which he established his camp, the healthy condition of his donkeys, and most tellingly, that haunting inscription, Nemo 1934, carved into the stone, we begin to see the outline of something far more profound than a simple hiking accident. Captain Nemo, the literary character from Jules Verne's novels, represented the ultimate rejection of civilized society, a man who chose to disappear completely from the world above to live freely in the depths of the ocean. Everett's choice of this pseudonym was no accident. It was a declaration, a final signature on a life lived entirely on his own terms. By 1934, at just 20 years old, Everett had already experienced more wilderness than most people encounter in a lifetime. He had pushed the boundaries of what was possible for a young man with limited resources and unlimited dreams. The evidence suggests that Everett made a conscious decision to step completely outside the world he had known. His camp wasn't abandoned in panic or desperation. It was left as a kind of shrine to his former life. The donkeys, well cared for and healthy, were his final gift to those who would inevitably come searching. He knew they would survive until found, and he knew they would signal to his family that his disappearance was intentional, not tragic. Consider the psychological profile of someone who would carve Nemo into stone. This wasn't a cry for help or a moment of despair. It was a calculated message, a breadcrumb left for those intelligent enough to understand its meaning. Everett was telling us that he had chosen to become Captain Nemo, to disappear into his own version of the Nautilus, which for him was the vast and uncharted wilderness of southern Utah. The romantic in us wants to believe that Everett found what he was searching for in those final months. Perhaps he discovered a hidden canyon where he could live completely off the land, sustained by springs and game, sheltered by ancient cliff dwellings. Perhaps he integrated with Native American communities who understood and respected his desire to live outside the constraints of modern society. The Navajo and other tribes of the region had their own traditions of individuals who chose to walk away from ordinary life to pursue spiritual enlightenment in the wilderness. But the realist in us must acknowledge that even the most carefully planned disappearance faces the unforgiving arithmetic of survival. Winter comes early and hard in the high desert. Water sources freeze or disappear entirely. Game becomes scarce. The same wilderness that had nurtured Everett's artistic soul through 3 summers would have tested his physical limits in ways he had never experienced. The flash floods that regularly carved new channels through the slot canyons may have claimed his remains, washing them downstream or burying them under tons of debris. The same geological forces that created the stunning landscape Everett loved so deeply would have made quick work of any trace of his final camp or resting place. In a region where entire rock formations can be reshaped by a single storm, the remains of one young man would vanish without a trace. What makes Everett's story so compelling is that both interpretations, the romantic and the realistic, lead to the same conclusion. Whether he died attempting to live his dream or succeeded in disappearing completely into the wilderness, he achieved something that most of us never will. He lived authentically, intensely, and entirely according to his own vision of what life should be. The modern world has tried repeatedly to solve the mystery of Everett Roos through DNA testing, archaeological investigation, and exhaustive research. But perhaps the mystery is the point. Perhaps Everett understood something that we're still struggling to grasp, that some questions are more powerful than their answers, that some stories are more meaningful when they remain unresolved. In our age of constant connectivity, GPS tracking and digital surveillance, the idea that someone could simply vanish into the wilderness seems almost impossible. Every hiker carries a beacon, every trail is mapped and monitored, every missing person becomes the subject of massive search and rescue operations. Everett's disappearance represents the last echo of a time when it was still possible to step completely outside the known world and become something else entirely. The inscription, Nemo 1934, wasn't just Everett's signature on the landscape. It was his signature on history, his way of ensuring that his story would endure long after the physical evidence had been scattered by wind and water. He became exactly what he set out to become, a legend, a mystery, a symbol of the eternal human desire to live wildly and authentically in the face of a world that demands conformity and compromise. Whether Everett Roos died in those canyons or lived on in some hidden corner of the wilderness, he achieved the immortality that comes from becoming more than just a person. He became an idea, a reminder that it's still possible to choose mystery over certainty, adventure over security, and freedom over safety. And yet, nearly a century after his disappearance, Everett Roos continues to captivate us in ways that transcend the simple mystery of what happened to him in Davis Gulch. His story has become something far more profound than just another missing person case. It has transformed into a meditation on the fundamental questions that haunt every human soul. What does it mean to live authentically? How do we balance our need for connection with our desire for solitude? And perhaps most crucially, what price are we willing to pay for the privilege of living life entirely on our own terms? The inscription, Nemo 1934, carved into the sandstone near his final camp, has become one of the most haunting signatures in American wilderness lore. Captain Nemo, Jules Verne's mysterious submarine commander who chose exile from civilization, represents the ultimate romantic figure who rejects society's constraints in favor of absolute freedom. That Everett would choose this particular pseudonym in what may have been his final act of self-expression tells us everything we need to know about his state of mind and his ultimate intentions. But the power of Everett's story extends far beyond literary symbolism. In an age where we are more connected than ever before, yet paradoxically more isolated, his deliberate choice to sever ties with the modern world resonates with a deep longing that many of us recognize but few dare to act upon. He represents the path not taken, the voice within us that whispers about abandoning our obligations and losing ourselves in the vastness of untamed landscapes. The search efforts that followed his disappearance revealed both the dedication of those who cared about him and the overwhelming challenge of finding anyone in the labyrinthine canyon country of southern Utah. The fact that his 2 donkeys were found healthy and well cared for, grazing peacefully in the makeshift corral he had constructed, speaks to his competence as a wilderness traveler. This was not the camp of someone who had panicked or lost control. Everything was organized, methodical, deliberate. The absence of any signs of struggle or hasty departure suggests that whatever happened to Everett Roos was either entirely accidental or entirely intentional. The landscape itself became a character in his story. The desert Southwest in the 1930s was still largely unmapped, unexplored, and unforgiving. The slot canyons that honeycomb the region could swallow a person without a trace, especially during flash floods that could move boulders the size of automobiles and strip away any evidence of human presence. The sheer scale of the search area, combined with the primitive technology available to searchers in 1935, meant that even the most thorough efforts covered only a fraction of the terrain where Everett might have traveled. Weather patterns in the high desert create their own deadly challenges. The temperature swings between day and night can be extreme, and winter storms can arrive with little warning. A person caught unprepared in such conditions, even someone with Everett's experience, could succumb to exposure within hours. The desert's ability to preserve some things while completely erasing others means that evidence of his fate could have been scattered to the winds decades ago, or it could still be waiting, mummified in some hidden alcove, for the right person to stumble upon it. The various theories about his disappearance each reflect different aspects of his complex personality and the era in which he lived. The suggestion that he might have been murdered by cattle rustlers or other criminals speaks to the lawless nature of the frontier in the 1930s, when remote areas were often beyond the reach of effective law enforcement. But this theory fails to account for the undisturbed nature of his camp and the fact that his valuable equipment was left behind. The romantic notion that he deliberately disappeared to start a new life, perhaps with a Native American bride, appeals to our desire for happy endings and reflects his genuine interest in and respect for indigenous cultures. His journals document his efforts to learn Navajo and his participation in Hopi ceremonies, suggesting a man who was genuinely drawn to alternative ways of understanding the world. Yet this theory, too, seems inconsistent with his character. Everett was not someone who hid from difficult truths or avoided confrontation with his family. If he had chosen to abandon his old life, it seems more likely that he would have communicated this decision rather than simply vanishing. The DNA controversy surrounding the remains discovered on Combe Ridge in 2009 illustrates both our desperate need for closure and the limitations of scientific certainty when dealing with historical mysteries. The initial announcement that the remains were those of Everett Roos created international headlines and seemed to solve one of America's most enduring wilderness mysteries. When subsequent analysis revealed that the DNA testing had been flawed and the remains were actually those of a Native American individual, the disappointment was palpable. The episode demonstrated how our desire for answers can sometimes lead us to accept conclusions that don't withstand scrutiny. This scientific controversy also highlights the ethical dimensions of using modern technology to investigate historical mysteries. The remains that were initially misidentified as Everett's belonged to someone else, presumably someone with their own story and their own family. The focus on solving the Everett Roos mystery risked overshadowing the dignity and humanity of the actual person whose bones had been discovered. It serves as a reminder that every mystery involves real people with real lives, not just puzzles to be solved for our entertainment. The enduring fascination with Everett's story reflects broader changes in American society since the 1930s. In his time, the choice to abandon civilization for the wilderness was seen as either noble or foolish, depending on one's perspective. Today, with our increasing awareness of environmental destruction and the psychological costs of modern life, his decision appears almost prophetic. He anticipated the alienation that would come to characterize much of contemporary existence, and his response was to reject it entirely. His influence on subsequent generations of artists, writers, and adventurers has been profound. The counterculture movement of the 1960s embraced him as a patron saint of dropping out, while environmental activists have found inspiration in his deep connection to the natural world. Contemporary artists and writers continue to mine his journals and letters for insights into the creative process and the relationship between solitude and artistic expression. The fact that his story has inspired songs, books, documentary films, and countless pilgrimages to the sites where he traveled speaks to something universal in his experience. He represents the part of ourselves that yearns for absolute freedom, for the ability to live without compromise or apology. In a world that increasingly demands conformity and connection, his choice to embrace solitude and uncertainty appears both admirable and terrifying. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Everett Roos's legacy is how his physical disappearance has only amplified his spiritual presence. By vanishing so completely, he achieved a kind of immortality that would have been impossible had he lived a conventional life. His absence has become more powerful than his presence ever was, creating a space that each generation fills with its own hopes and fears about what it means to live authentically. The landscape he loved has been transformed since his disappearance. Glen Canyon, where he spent his final weeks, was largely flooded by the creation of Lake Powell in the 1960s. The reservoir now covers many of the places where he camped and explored, creating a watery grave for the canyons he described so eloquently in his writings. This development adds another layer of poignancy to his story, as the very places that shaped his artistic vision have been sacrificed to progress and development. Yet even as the physical landscape has changed, the spiritual landscape that Everett mapped in his journals and letters remains intact. His descriptions of sunrise over the desert, of the sound of wind through stone arches, of the profound silence that can only be found in true wilderness, continue to resonate with readers who may never set foot in the Southwest. Through his words, he created a parallel universe where beauty and meaning could exist independent of society's demands. The mystery of his disappearance has become inseparable from the message of his life. Had he returned from his final journey, had he grown old and died in bed surrounded by family and friends, his story would have been just another tale of youthful adventure eventually tempered by adult responsibility. Instead, his disappearance at the age of 20 transformed him into a permanent symbol of the road not taken, the life unlived, the price of absolute freedom. The inscription, Nemo 1934, thus becomes not just a clue to his fate, but a statement of his philosophy. Like Verne's submarine captain, Everett chose to become nobody, to disappear into the vastness of the unknown, rather than accept the limitations of the known world. Whether this disappearance was planned or accidental may ultimately be less important than the fact that it represents the logical conclusion of a life lived according to its own internal compass. In the end, Everett Roos achieved what every artist dreams of. He became his own masterpiece. His life story, incomplete and mysterious as it is, has proven more enduring than any painting he might have created or any poem he might have written. By disappearing into the landscape he loved, he became part of it forever. His presence felt in every sunset over the desert, every wind-carved arch, every hidden canyon where silence reigns supreme. The teenager who wrote that he would rather die in the wilderness than live a comfortable life in civilization got his wish, though perhaps not in the way he intended. His disappearance serves as both inspiration and warning, reminding us that the pursuit of absolute freedom carries absolute risks. Yet for those who feel trapped by the demands of modern life, his story continues to whisper of possibilities, of paths that lead away from the beaten track and into the unknown. Everett Roos remains forever 20 years old, forever on the verge of his next great adventure, forever seeking beauty in the untamed places of the world. His story reminds us that some mysteries are more powerful unsolved, that some questions are more important than their answers, and that the human spirit's capacity for wonder and exploration can transcend even death itself. In choosing to disappear, he achieved the ultimate artistic statement. He became legend.